Hi, I'm Allison Zmuda, and I am so super jazzed to spend some time with Mike Anderson. He is a colleague and a dear friend and a prolific author. So, Mike, how many books is this right now?
This is number 9.
Woo-hoo!
I know, it's weird.
And this particular book that we're going to have a conversation around is Tackling the Motivation Crisis. So, Mike, thanks for joining me.
Yeah, thank you so much, Allison. It's so much fun to be with you.
Well, as I read this book for the third time, that's right. It's not that I'm a slow learner, but I had an opportunity to take a sneak peek even before it came out. And then I read it when it came out. And just for this interview, I wanted to make sure as I continue to reflect and prepare that the conversation is really grounded in what we're seeing in our classrooms right now, pandemic or fingers crossed post-pandemic. So, Mike, talk a little bit about the motivation for the book and also the crazy subtitle after the colon.
Yeah, so it's funny that that the book came out when it did, because I started writing the book before we knew there was going to be a pandemic. I was already probably halfway through the draft when COVID hit in March of 2020. But since the book has come out, a lot of people assume that the book is all about dealing with the challenges we've had with kids' motivation during the pandemic. And I have to keep reminding everybody, 3 years ago, we weren't skipping through the hallways, singing and dancing, saying, yay, our kids are so motivated. They love doing all the schoolwork,
Yeah.
So I think that this motivation crisis, as I'm framing it, has been building for quite a while. And so really the motivation for writing the book has been about helping teachers kind of reframe how we think about student motivation. Because I think that for a long time, we've viewed it in schools primarily through a behaviorist's lens.
Yeah.
And so we think about motivation as something that we do to kids. A great teacher is somebody we say motivates their students.
Mm.
I would argue that a great teacher is one who helps kids become more self-motivated.
Yeah.
Those
And
are
well,
two
and the focus of this particular first part of our interview is I affectionately titled it Why Incentivizing Extrinsic Motivation Almost Always Backfires. And I was really drawn to a quote that you wrote later in the book, that children are being taught slowly and almost imperceptibly to refocus their attention away from the joy of learning and to what their teacher wants them to do. So talk a little bit about the idea of why extrinsic motivation potentially backfires always in the long term, but has some promise in the short term.
Yeah, well, and this is why that subtitle of the book that you were referring to is so important. So the subtitle is something along the lines of like how to activate student learning without pizza bar parties, behavior charts, or other hard to quit incentive systems. It's a very long, bulky subtitle. But I wanted it to be really clear that this book is a pushback on so much of the behaviorism that we've come to cling to in schools. And so what we often see in schools is that when we use things like behavior charts, where we're moving clips up and down according to how well kids are staying focused or cooperating or being kind or whatever, or when we say to kids, if you work really hard, then we'll put another marble in the marble jar and 20 more marbles and we get a pizza party. What we often see is those systems seem to work in the short term. And I put work in quotes because we often don't define what we actually want to have happen with those systems. We are just looking for something that works. So what usually happens is that kids are compliant for short periods of time. Those systems are enough to kind of hook their attention for a little bit of time so that they're trying hard to do whatever we want them to do to get the pizza party. But then there are all kinds of really interesting things that happen that psychology has helped us understand that lead to a long-term erosion of intrinsic motivation, joy for learning, a sense of ownership for learning, even really clearly achievement, right, and learning itself when we rely on these systems.
So it's fascinating because as you're starting to describe that, there's like two categories in my mind. I think one category is it makes people feel good. It makes teachers feel good from a manager point of view, from a control point of view.
I'm doing something. I put a
Right.
marble in the marble jar. I moved the clip up and down. It gives this teacher this facade of control.
Well, and that's interesting, because I was thinking about the marble jar as being a little bit different. I was thinking in my mind that the second part of it is that it has like this tangibility that feels good, not just to the teacher from a manager point of view, but from the student or students, like, wow, I'm being celebrated. And especially if grades or marks are not something that I'm generally celebrated by, to what extent does that kind of satisfaction of the marble being placed in the jar and the kudos that come with that actually a different dimension of intrinsic motivation that's still also backfires?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Because there's absolutely this, you get this little dopamine rush when you get that marble in the jar, or when you get the check on the checklist. And it feels really good in the moment. And that's a real thing, no doubt. And there are still ways that we should make sure we're acknowledging and recognizing kids for the work that they're doing. I want to be really clear about that. I was just saying to a group of teachers the other day, none of you are allowed to leave this workshop and say, Mike Anderson said we're not allowed to have pizza parties anymore. Right. Like, I'm actually all in on pizza parties. Let's just not make it something that we tell kids that they get only if they do the work that we want. Like, we should be having a pizza party to celebrate an awesome writer's workshop. Yep. We've just published our class book. Let's celebrate with a class book read aloud and have families come in, and we'll have pizza for lunch. Like, we should totally do that. It's when we use it as the motivation for writing that we do the damage. Yep. And so that's something that's important to realize about the psychology of this. It feels good when the marble goes in the jar, but every time we're doing that, what we're reinforcing is that you should get something for doing the positive deed. You don't feel good about doing the deed. You feel good about getting the marble. Yeah. And that's where the damage is done. I can give you a quick example of this. When my daughter was in one of her younger elementary school grades, they had a version of the marble jar that was being used. They weren't collecting marbles, they were collecting warm fuzzies. So they were little pom-pom balls that the teacher would drop into the jar every time the kids walked quietly in the hall or got a compliment from another teacher. Almost always, it was about being quiet or compliant. That's usually what it was about, which is another conversation. But the reward when the class filled up the warm fuzzy jar was that they got to have a goof off day. The way the teacher articulated that to these 6-year-olds was, you're going to get to come to school in PJs and you're going to get to play games all day long. You won't have to do any work. Yeah. And then she said to parents at open house night, but kids are actually doing, like, we're playing math and reading games all day, but they're having so much fun, they don't even know they're learning. And I remember hearing this and thinking, oh my gosh, first of all, why wouldn't we want kids to know that they're having fun when they're learning? Yeah. Don't we want them to associate the learning itself with joy? Yeah. And when we give kids the message that the reward for good behavior is that you won't have to do schoolwork, what kinds of messages are we sending about what schoolwork is all about? Clearly, it's something distasteful that kids should not want to like. And that's part of how we erode kids' sense of joy and wonder and intrinsic motivation over time, is by the sort of subtle messaging that these systems deliver.
Well, and it's interesting because you're foreshadowing what we'll talk about in part 2 around one of the 6 intrinsic motivators. But the other undercurrent is really starting to think about how students are sort of rising up to challenges, or potentially flatlining when there is continued complexity and rigor and expectation. So I think the last quick piece on extrinsic motivation, I want to talk about grades for a minute. Yeah. So I had the privilege in the last month of chatting with Star, who did a beautiful job really thinking about how we can continue to assess learning without quantifying the mark associated with it. And I do know that you spent a fair bit of time in pockets throughout the book talking about grading and extrinsic motivation. So can you talk a little bit about that in relation to the incentivizing piece?
Yeah, so I think we could have really dynamic, amazing learning in school without grading. I don't think we could have amazing, dynamic learning in school without assessment. So first, let's just be really clear that those are two really different things. And oftentimes the way grading is articulated to kids is it is the reward or the punishment for doing or not doing what we want them to do as students. If you work really hard, you'll get good grades. If you don't study for the test, you'll get bad grades. It's the prize or the consequence. And so that is how grading is often used as an extrinsic motivator, which once again diminishes the value of the work itself. What we're now saying is what you should care about is the grade. And the work itself is your ticket to getting the grade or not getting the grade that you want. And so we're actually minimizing the importance of work itself. And I can give you a quick example of a teacher I was working with last year in a school who was really playing with work moving away from this system. So it was a middle school teacher in a school that had 7 or 8 years ago tried to move away from traditional grades. They tried to move to competencies, and it didn't work well. Townspeople grabbed torches and pitchforks, and it was not good. So the school has been really burned by an attempted transition. So they're not moving there again anytime soon. But this teacher teaches 8th grade math. He wanted to move away from the traditional use of grades with his students. So what he tried one time with a whole bunch of us there observing was he gave his students 4 different math assessments that they could choose from. And each of the math assessments assessed all 4 competencies that they'd been working on in the unit. But there were a variety of ways in which kids could show their assessments or show their understanding through those different assessments. And so as the kids he was explaining this to them and was telling them about the choices and how they were going to work with the choices. Of course, one of the kids said, how are you going to grade this? I loved the way he answered it. He said, I don't know. I haven't figured that part out yet. And I thought, just that alone shows that he's focused on the assessment, not on the grade, that he was willing to go into this experiment, not quite knowing that part yet. So then what he did was all of the kids did at least 2 of those 4 assessments, and he looked through their work samples for evidence of whether or not they had mastered the competencies they'd been working on. He then had to put a grade into PowerSchool. And so he came up with sort of a sliding way of showing, if you mastered all 4 competencies, that was an A. If you had 3 and 1 was only partially competent, that was an A-. He created a sliding scale.
Yeah.
But that was a great example of how he put the assessment and the learning in front of the grade in the whole process.
Well, and it's fabulous too, Mike, because you're also foreshadowing where we're heading in part 3 and part 4. Part 3 is really going to be grounded in what do we do to grow the capacity of students as self-managers and self-modifiers. And I think the other part of it too is, so what's the role of the teacher in all of this? And that's going to be what we chat about in part 4. So stay tuned to part 2, where we're going to talk about the 6 intrinsic motivators. And Mike, thanks for joining me.
Absolutely.